Welcome to Bread for the People. I'm Jim Serpico. Today's dad. Welcome to Bread for the People. This is Jim Serpico. I'm going to do that again. Welcome to Bread for the... Today I'm speaking with Tom Cucuzza, the Cleveland-based sourdough baker obsessed with helping other bakers understand the science behind baking bread. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining me. I take it you're beaming in from the International Institute of the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio. Is that
exactly
correct?
Right. Also known as my kitchen.
Your kitchen. You share so much with the bread making community. On behalf of everyone out there, I wanted to thank you, and I've learned a lot by watching you, and I really appreciate you sharing it. What was your motivation to do that and share all this with everyone?
That's a good question. I started sourdough baking, relatively recently. It was the winter of 2019, and I retired in the summer of 2019. I had some time on my hands. I was looking for hobbies, so I was starting to learn to make sourdough bread myself. And I went out to YouTube to find the videos, and because that's how I generally learn how to do things. And I just wasn't seeing really good videos out there that went step by step through the process. It takes a day and a half to make a sourdough loaf, and there were like 8-minute videos trying to teach people how to make sourdough, and it just wasn't working for me. So I put myself in the shoes of a beginner, because I was a beginner at the time. And after I baked 4 or 5 loaves, I got this idea that I would start recording my bakes as a beginner, so that I could really capture all those questions that the beginners have and give them the answers. Because once you become an expert at it, it's hard to go back in time, because you're doing so much just instinctively. So that was really the motivation. Was I was a beginner and I wasn't happy with what I was finding out there. So I wanted to create content for other people to be able to use, especially home bakers, because so many people attempt sourdough baking and then they quit. It's just an unbelievable failure rate. So that's really how I got started. Then I also got involved in some of the Facebook and social media groups for sourdough bakers. And I really enjoyed that, because I was doing really one-on-one coaching with people. And pretty quickly, I developed my own expertise. I put the time in to really learn the craft. And then people would, post pictures of their loaves. You've seen this before. And they show you a bisection of the loaf and say, what happened to my loaf? And I got, really good at reading the crumb of a sourdough loaf, where, I probably do, dozens of these a day. I've probably looked at thousands of them. And I literally, can look at the crumb of a loaf and know a lot about how it was baked, what was the recipe, what was the bulk fermentation, how did you shape it, how did you bake it? Every loaf tells a story just by looking at that picture of the loaf at the end. So I found that to be interesting and challenging for me. Then I really wanted to dig into that and really understand the nuance of, like, how can you tell if a loaf is, slightly underproofed or slightly overproofed? The extreme ends are easy to tell, but I was really trying to, hone in on the margins and figure out how to give people specific guidance. So I started doing these really detailed scientific experiment type of videos, where I'd bake 6 loaves of bread, and I would bulk ferment, one of them for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, and then compare them side by side. So you could really dial it in and say, okay, at 4.5 hours, that was the sweet spot, for this recipe. Because in sourdough baking, this, everything's temperature sensitive, and things can go south in 30 minutes. Literally, that's kind of the window that I think you have in bulk fermentation. If you're fermenting at roughly 80 degrees Fahrenheit dough temperature, that window is incredibly small. So, I started doing these experiments. Then I started doing experiments on shaping. What if you do, loose shaping versus tight shaping? What does that do to the shape of the loaf? And what does that do to the crumb? I did experiments on baking temperatures, going from baking at 400 degrees Fahrenheit up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit and all the stops in between. And it's just fascinating how much these small changes, impact the outcome. So I kind of got obsessed with that. And then I wanted to share it, because nobody else was doing experiments at this level of detail. So my videos that I started creating were these long format videos because with sourdough baking, all the steps are interrelated. So you can't just skip the steps and show the bread at the end and try to explain what happened. You got to kind of tell the story. So I created this format of doing long format, scientifically repeatable experiments, which means you could follow one of my videos and I'd have high confidence you could create the exact same outcome because I show all the steps that are germane to the outcome. But then I still felt like the videos were too long and people, weren't really spending the time to watch them. So then I recently created a website at thesourdoughjourney.com where I started to create, summaries of frequently asked questions. I have something like 250 of the most common frequently asked questions out there. And I'm able to insert my video clips into the questions. So instead of watching a 90-minute video, you can say, what's the impact of shaping on open crumb? I describe it in the text. I say, here's what happens when you do tight shaping versus loose shaping. And here's the video, the 6-minute segment of the video that actually shows, that difference. So it's been this great combination of having the video content out there and then being able to tie it in with the website now, where I'm just trying to create a complete package for people to learn. Because back to your original question. I mean, a lot of people love sourdough baking. I love teaching people, how to bake sourdough. That I get more excitement out of the teaching than I do out of the baking. I love baking and eating as well, but it's the teaching. I really love that.
Well, I have put in questions about sourdough baking into Google, and your videos have popped up. So that's how I first discovered you.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for that. How old is the website compared to the videos?
I started the videos in January of 2019, right before the pandemic. And then I just launched the website really in its full form about 2 or 3 months ago. So I just got it up. I built it last year, but there wasn't a lot of content out there. Then over the winter, I really built out a huge amount of content on the website and really fully launched that in January of this year, 2022.
Right. You talk about so many different things. I saw, I'll give you this one. The answer is 3. What's the question? See if you remember this one.
How many times do you feed your starter after it comes out of the refrigerator?
How many countries don't use the metric system?
Oh, yeah. That too. Yes.
You know what's interesting about that? So I differ from you. I started a year after you, and it started just as a hobby, and then people started buying it, right? So my lane is right now trying to create an empire, trying to become good enough where the bread is good enough where it sells, and I could sell it mass. I'll be honest, right? I'm interested in the marketing. I'm interested in selling. I love going to farmers markets. So we differ there. I have to say a struggle I have in all this is at the beginning. I did not use Chad Robertson's book at the beginning. So many of the recipes are in cups and volume measurements. And I got really deep into having to scale my recipes at that. And I'm still at the point where now I have to go back and try to convert everything. It's really frustrating because I did not start baking with a scale. It's a difficult process for me right now.
That's one of the most interesting things that I found is that a lot of the recipes are now most of the popular ones show the recipe in grams using the metric system, and that level of accuracy is important. I mean, I've done some experiments where I add 10 grams of extra water, 20 grams of water, 30 grams of water. It makes a significant difference because you're pushing the hydration of the flour right up to the saturation point. That's really where you really get that super open crumb kind of country loaf in the tartine style. And it's kind of like the comparison I use is like when you're mixing up a bag of concrete and it's stiff, and you put that one extra splash of water into it and it turns to soup and you can't go backwards. I mean, the flour is kind of the same way where it gets, it's stiff, it loosens up, and then boom, it goes past the saturation point and you can't go back. That can be 10 grams in 1,000 gram, recipe of flour.
Yeah. For me, if I'm personally doing the mixing, which is an awful lot of the time, I
Yeah.
could feel it now. I could
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I have people who work for me who are not experienced at all.
Right. Yeah.
And they're following my formulas, and I might be doing other things or not looking or not even be around. And boy, it's crazy the difference in the consistency of the dough and the final outcome.
And do you see differences in different, even if you're using the same flour, do you see differences, week to week in the type of flour that you use? I've even seen differences bag to bag with some of the flours, where their ability to absorb, water can differ pretty significantly, even the same brand, the same, label, just a different bag.
I definitely have.
Yeah.
I also source my flour from 2 different places. I recently switched, and I know for sure they store the flour very differently because one of the bags comes completely flattened out, so they're obviously sitting on top of each other, and the other place doesn't. So many of these things matter, and also you don't know with one of these places. I don't know how much flour they actually go through. One of them I know specializes in bakers, and they're moving it.
Yeah.
The other place, I don't know how often the flour's going out and how long it's been sitting around.
Yeah.
So that certainly makes a difference.
Yeah, and that's why I like to focus on the science and say, measure your ingredients accurately, understand what your dough temperature is, because you need to get all that stuff right to be able to react to the other kind of small differences that you're talking about. If a bag of flour, one bag of flour is different than another, you can't catch your bulk fermentation at exactly the right moment. You get a little bit of loose dough at the end. What do? You got to shape it differently. You got to, possibly bake it differently. You got to do a shorter, cold retard. Because like I said, it's that chain of events where everything's connected. And if you don't get the easy stuff right, there's 100 other things that can go wrong. So I'm like, take the gimmies while you get them, measure your ingredients accurately, know what your dough temperature is, follow the steps as closely as you can so you get a repeatable process. Then you react to reality. And you're living this much more than I am. I mean, you're running a bakery. You're the emergency room doctor compared to me. I'm like I'm the research doctor at the university figuring this stuff out. You're dealing with it every day.
Yeah, but I bet you know a lot more about the science of it than I do. So I'm not the greatest doctor. It is different when you're trying to do so many loaves at one time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And my stuff ramps up for the weekend because I'm really a farmer's market guy.
Okay. How many loaves are you doing on a weekend typically?
On a Saturday, I could be putting out 400 to 500 loaves.
Oh yeah, wow.
On Sunday, it's a little less because I'm only going to do a couple. I do 3 markets on a Saturday and 2 on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, and then all those steps. That's the part. Like, it's very hard to auto lease your dough and do stretch and folds,
right,
and bench proofing,
yeah,
and bulk fermentation.
Yeah.
In the small facility I have without many employees.
Yeah.
That's the part I see this. I see what goes into, you're showing people how to make 1 loaf of bread.
Yeah.
Because that's what most people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that's who you're catering to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though there's a lot of us using you as a resource.
Yeah.
That are on the semi-professional side. But I try to figure out how do I take that and bring it over on the mass scale side. And there are ways to do it.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing I found when I really dug into Chad Robertson's book, Tartine Bread. That's one of the most popular sourdough books out there. And I was trying to figure out why he does, what he does in that recipe, because it's real popular. And a lot of other recipes are based on that. But I didn't really know why he does it that way. And when you really dig into it, it's interesting because he was running a one-man bakery.
Exactly.
So almost every decision he made in that method and process had to do with labor saving, because he doesn't do an auto lease. He does a fermented lease where he adds the starter right away.
That's what I
because
do.
he's like, I don't have all day to sit around. I got to get this thing going. He doesn't add the salt right at that time because that gives you a faster start. So again, he's trying to compress that time up front, get the fermentation jump started. He then bulk ferments at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius. That's a really warm bulk fermentation temperature where a lot of things can go south in a hurry. But he's trying to get as many loaves baked as he can because he also liked to surf at the end of the day. So he would come in the morning, and if he wants to get his loaves done quickly, you ramp up the bulk fermentation temperature because that speeds everything up. You get out of the bakery sooner. That is probably the reason he bulk ferments at that temperature. It's not a typical room temperature in a kitchen, maybe in a bakery, but I don't think so. I think, he was speeding up the fermentation process so he could move things along. The stretch and fold method is basically a method that you use when you're making dough in giant tubs. If you've seen these guys that do the folding of the dough in the tubs, he describes the stretch and fold version in the book for home bakers as if you're doing that in a bowl, but he wasn't doing it in a bowl. He was doing it in giant, the large capacity tubs. And then the cold retard is because I don't want to bake, tonight I want to bake early tomorrow morning. He lived in San Francisco. They have cool nights there where he would let the dough, I think he even let the dough sit out. I don't think he used a refrigerator originally for the overnight cold proofing because that was the climate that he worked in. So you kind of put all those constraints together and you come up with the tartine recipe, which is now, one of the most popular recipes out there. That was based on the way Chad made bread. I don't think he scientifically devised it. It makes fantastic bread. I mean, I've tried all kinds of recipes and I still go back to that one when I really want to make, my attempt at a perfect loaf. I think the bulk fermentation at the warmer temperature, actually, the bread tastes better. I think it ferments more fully. So I actually like that warm fermentation temperature of 80 degrees, but it's hard to do, especially for novices or people who aren't monitoring their dough temperature. Because you get it up to 84, 85 degrees, the gluten starts breaking down. Those loaves go south, in a hurry.
Yeah. Now, I currently do both. I do a bulk fermentation that's not refrigerated, and I do a refrigerated one.
Okay.
And I do that based on completely based on my schedule.
Yeah.
Similar to him. It's not that I'm going surfing, but
right.
I have a life to live.
Yeah.
And this stuff takes a long time. So the one thing that I've noticed, because from the very beginning, I had decent proofing bread, and they would come out and they would rise. They would do everything in the oven. They would spring, but they weren't sour tasting. And I know his bread isn't particularly sour tasting.
That's right. Yeah.
But I want part of that. My guess is also because of the time.
Yeah.
And I do notice now, like we had one the other week that we ate here at my home with my family, and we were all freaking out because it was so sour tasting, and it was one of the first times I ever had it.
Yeah.
And it was because it was in the refrigerator for like 3 or 4 days.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I found where I did some early experiments where I made, I think 6 loaves and I put them in the refrigerator for 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours. I went up to 5 days with these loaves, and 3 days was about the sweet spot where you get that real biting sour flavor and the loaf still isn't deteriorating. It's a little bit, you lose a little bit of structure by day 3. You get into day 4 and day 5 and the flavor profile becomes a little more bitter, and the loaf starts to flatten out a little bit because the gluten's continuing to deteriorate just with time. But even by day 5, you get a decent looking loaf, and it's super sour, but it's sour with a little bit of an aftertaste, which I didn't find has kind of an off note in it, I think, from going too long. But that 3-day mark in the refrigerator is really good if you're trying to get the sourness through the cold retard. Other people try to get that sour flavor through mixing up their starters differently. What I found is that by using different types of flour, that brings out the sour flavor pretty substantially, even if you use the exact same process.
In the starter?
No, in the dough.
In the dough.
Yeah.
I started doing that. I started adding 20% rye flour.
Yeah. That's the easiest way. I think I think the flavor that a lot of people associate with kind of that classic San Francisco sourdough flavor is actually rye flour. I think that was just always in there. I don't know if people will admit that or not, but when I add rye to my loaves, you're like, oh, this is that sourdough flavor that I remember, eating on Fisherman's Wharf. Um, but there's more to it than that. But I think rye is definitely part of it. And then when you use more like freshly milled flours that have a little bit more of the bran and germ in them, that imparts a little bit more of the sour flavor as well, in my opinion. It just creates a more complex flavor. I don't know if you want to call it all sourness. And then what people do with their starters is, some people say if you use a stiff starter versus a liquid starter, you can change the sourness. I've dabbled with that a little bit. I can't say I have the answer to that, but I found that trying to tweak the starter to improve the sourness of the loaf, I didn't see a huge bang for the buck by doing that.
The one thing I heard you talk about, and I thought of it when you said something about tight shaping versus a loose shaping. You were talking about strengthening your starter. I don't know if it has more to do with it, but it certainly has something to do with the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's sometimes that whether it's loose or tight, the crumb structure may come out the exact same depending on your starter. Is that right?
Yeah. This is probably one of the deepest mysteries of sourdough baking, that it's almost impossible to describe, and you find very little of it in the books. Is that this idea of strengthening your starter? Basically, there are two things in your starter. There's yeast, which is kind of the good guy, and there's lactic acid bacteria, which is the bad guy. Because the yeast is trying to rise the loaf, the lactic acid bacteria creates acid or vinegar, which basically tries to deteriorate the loaf. And you can't separate those things. That's why people quit making sourdough bread, because they figured out how to strip the yeast out, and then you don't have to worry about your loaf, deteriorating at the end. But when you're making sourdough, you have this epic battle in your starter of the yeast trying to rise the loaf, and the lactic acid bacteria is trying to melt the loaf, trying to destroy the loaf. That's just what it does as the acidity increases. So when people talk about strengthening their starter, in my opinion, it's really about de-acidifying the starter. It's giving your yeast more of a head start, and it's trying to reduce the population of the lactic acid bacteria, so the yeast has time to rise the loaf before the lactic acid bacteria has time to deteriorate the loaf. Lactic acid bacteria will always outrun the yeast. It outnumbers the yeast 100 to 1 in terms of the number of cells. And the yeast goes through kind of a bell curve where, the yeast will start creating carbon dioxide, it starts peaking, and then it kind of runs out of gas when you get towards the end of bulk fermentation. The lactic acid bacteria never runs out of gas. It's just like a straight line up to infinity. It just keeps creating acid. So it's those two curves that you have going on, where the yeast is going to rise and then run out of steam. Lactic acid bacteria is just going to create acid. So you have to get that starter set up so the yeast has a fighting chance, and you want to have a high yeast population and a low lactic acid bacteria population before you put it in your dough. And that significantly changes how your doughs bulk ferment and how they bake and how they taste. And that's one of the rarely documented aspects of sourdough baking. People talk about strengthening the starter, and all they're talking about is the yeast. Is you want to have a lot, high yeast population. It's not so much about the absolute population of the yeast, it's the relative population. You want more yeast than the lactic acid bacteria. That profoundly changed my loaves once I figured that out. And the way that I do that, there are different techniques. You do this all the time because you're running a bakery, but people who keep their starter in the refrigerator, or people who keep it on the countertop, it gets real acidic over time. So anytime before I bake, I'll take my starter and I'll feed it at least 3 times. As soon as the starter peaks, you discard 80%, do a 1-2-2 feeding, it comes back again. As soon as it peaks, discard 80%. So what you're doing there is you're de-acidifying it. You're throwing out the acid and you're rebalancing the yeast population.
I wanted to ask you about that 80% discard.
Yeah.
That's a lot of discard for someone like me.
Yeah. No,
a lot.
Yeah, no, that would be crazy. So in your case, I would start with well, I don't know how much starter you keep, and
I keep what are they? It's 24 quarts times 3.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah, so in that case, I wouldn't recommend that discard method to strengthen your starter because again, it's not strengthening, it's deacidifying. The other way to deacidify your starter is keep it cool.
That's what I do.
Exactly. So I mean, those are the two methods. If you keep it on your countertop, it's going to get acidic, and that's why you got to do the discard. That's for people who are keeping, a small jar of starter. But yeah, large quantity, keep it cool. Temperature is your absolute best friend.
Yeah, it also just, it stays at peak for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
It could be over 24 hours. I was just
Yep.
away for 4 days and wasn't able to. I tried the thing where when we first started, we were doing rotations and having my kids help feed the starter, but that lasted maybe 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's just me.
Yeah.
But I was away for 4 days, didn't feed it at all. I came home, I looked at it, man, and the top of it was still great and still domed, and I could have baked a loaf right then.
Yeah.
But the
Yep.
first thing I did when I got home last night at midnight was feed it.
Yeah. No, that's a good sign is if it doesn't, fall and become acidic, then that means you have a good yeast population to begin with. So that's always a good indicator. And then if you keep it cool, I've seen some studies that show that, I think they say like 55 degrees Fahrenheit is like the optimal temperature if you're going to keep your starter for a long time without feeding it.
Really? 55 degrees?
Yeah.
That's great. So have you had any major fails or struggles along the way?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Can you share some of those?
Yeah, some of them are in my videos. That's the other interesting thing is that I show everything. Like I've had disasters while I'm making a video and I still publish it. I edit it and publish it and I'm saying, gosh, I don't know if I should put this out there, but I always do because that's part of the learning process. And one of them related to the starter question was a video where I was doing a test on what's the difference of 45 minutes of incremental bulk fermentation time. And I kind of decided at the last minute to make this video. My starter wasn't really, ready to go, but I'm like, I'm going to try it anyways. And I started making the video and I got into it and it was just a disaster. I mean, the loaves just weren't rising and it's because the starter was super acidic and the loaves were just, they wouldn't rise. You could tell that the acidity was deteriorating the loaf before the yeast could rise it. So I played out the whole video and made 4 disastrous loaves on tape and really just showed that's what happens when you have a weak starter or an acidic starter. And it's a great example, especially for a lot of new, sourdough bakers who it takes a while to get your starter up to full strength when you create one from scratch. And a lot of people will post these pictures and say, what happened to my loaf? And I can just tell it's an immature starter because that yeast population hasn't grown enough yet and the lactic acid bacteria is going crazy. And it creates a real signature style of a loaf that looks kind of underproofed and overproofed at the same time. It's underproofed because you didn't have enough yeast to go around, and it's overproofed because the lactic acid bacteria broke down the gluten. It's a real signature style of a crumb. That was probably my biggest kind of disaster. I had other, challenges the first summer that I started baking. I mean, as everybody does, because I learned to bake in the winter, it's easier, your kitchen's cool. And then in the summer, the first time, you're trying to bake, your starter gets real warm. If you leave your starter, out of the refrigerator, gets real acidic. Your loaves ferment super quickly. You used to be able to leave a loaf on the countertop, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Now my kitchen's 80 degrees. I mean, that's like completely different style of baking.
At 80 degrees, is it just that it proofs much quicker and you have to get it in earlier, right?
Yeah, exactly. I did a video, and this is one of the most interesting ones that I did, was where I bulk fermented dough at 70 degrees dough temperature, 80 degree dough temperature, and 90 degree dough temperature. And you're like, well, who would ever make bread at 90 degree dough temperature? A lot of people who watch my videos and are on Facebook, they live in tropical climates where their kitchen temperatures, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. That is really challenging. So I'm like, well, I'm going to figure it out and figure out how to do it. So I baked these 3 loaves, and it's really interesting because the dough behaves completely differently at 70, 80, and 90 degrees.
Right.
Where at the end of that video, I create a summary chart where I call it the baking styles. The baking styles are kind of low and slow is 70 degrees, where you can let that sit on the countertop overnight and nothing bad's going to happen if you can keep your temperature between 68 and 70. And I call that's kind of like, riding a bicycle. 80 degrees is kind of the Chad Robertson zone, where your loaf can go south in 30 minutes, basically, if you bulk ferment it too long. And that's kind of like, riding a motorcycle. And then bulk fermenting at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you can bulk ferment start to finish in about 2 to 2.5 hours, which means you have about a 15-minute window before your dough starts going to hell. That's like riding a motorcycle without a helmet. I mean, it's crazy. It's just you're constantly monitoring the dough and working as fast as you can. You're sweating, but that's how some people bake.
Can you counteract that with less starter, using less starter?
That's an easy way to do it. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. You mix the dough with cold water when you start. You use less starter. That'll slow down that initial fermentation time. It buys you a couple hours, even if your room temperature is 90 degrees. And then, even in the summer, when some people switch from kind of winter baking, where you're overnight bulk fermenting on your countertop at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and then in the summer you're up at, say, 75 or as high as 80 for some people who don't run their air in the kitchen at night, you can accommodate that by using a really small amount of starter, mix it with cold water. And what I even do is I'll put the dough in my oven with an ice pack, like a freezer pack, like you put in your cooler, and then I go to bed and let it bulk ferment overnight. Even though my kitchen's 80, the oven will keep that temperature around 70 with the ice pack in there. It just buys you time.
Yeah. I notice it even more with instant yeast. If you're not using sourdough, that, depending on the temperature, makes it change even faster.
Crazy. Yeah.
Crazy. And I know people who mix with ice.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all, there's so many different ways to do it. But once you get used to one method, I'm so used to what I do right now.
Yeah.
It works for me by trial and error. Because when I first started, I would put stuff on the menu without having baked it before and say, I have 4 days to figure out how to do this.
Right.
And 70% of the time it worked out.
Yeah. I can imagine.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just on that topic, though. I like to try different methods to accommodate different people's schedules. Again, because I'm really focused on helping home bakers.
Right.
Some people, they can't attend the dough for 5 hours, on a Saturday. So, I mean, I've come up with a method where you just mix all the ingredients at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. You keep the dough at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't touch it. Don't do any stretch and folds at all. I just do a lot more hand mixing up front. I'll do, a slap and fold method, which is a little bit more aggressive style of hand mixing. So you do all the gluten development up front. You let it sit on the countertop. And when the dough is kept cool, 70 degrees, relatively cool, you can let it rise a little bit more and it won't overproof. So you have a little bit wider window to let the dough rise at lower temperatures. You get up in the morning, maybe that dough, I usually shoot for about a 75% rise in the dough if I'm overnight fermenting at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Then sometimes I'll skip pre-shaping entirely. I'll spend 5 minutes, shape the dough, put it in the refrigerator. I can bake it anytime in the next 3 days. So look at that timeline. At 8 o'clock one night, I decide I'm going to bake bread. I can go from a completely clean kitchen, dinner's done, kitchen's counter's clean. I can get all the stuff out, measure the flour, mix the dough, back to completely clean kitchen in 25 minutes is what it takes me to mix that whole thing up. I go to sleep at night. I get up the next morning. I spend 10 minutes, shape it, put it in the refrigerator, clean the kitchen again. And then I'm off the clock because it's in the fridge. I can bake it for dinner. I can bake it the next morning. I can bake it 2 days later. I can bake it 3 days later. I mean, it's literally a 35-minute, elapsed time process, including washing the dishes, cleaning the counter. I mean, a lot of these people say, you can make sourdough with 8 minutes of hands-on time or something. It's like, well, who's measuring the ingredients? Who's washing the dishes? Who's getting the Dutch oven out? I mean, I do this like a industrial engineer where I'm like, listen, these are the steps. Somebody's got to do the steps. And I've gotten that down into 25 minutes to basically do every step, including prep the whole oven for baking. So I have the Dutch oven in the oven. I got my parchment paper cut. I got my lamb put out. I got my rice flour for dusting. I got everything prepped for the next day. So that's something I'm really working on, because it's like sourdough baking for people who live real lives. You got to figure out a way to allow people to do this. It's one of the most, I guess, disappointing things of trying to help all these people learn how to bake is there's still just this massive failure rate and massive dropout rate from home bakers, either because they just don't get the technique down or they just can't make the time. So I'm trying to save as many of these people as I can, make the technique more accessible and make the time shorter.
Yeah, they're probably also intimidated by the lapse, the time lapse that it takes. But
For
like you
sure.
said, 25 minutes is nothing.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that really is it. Have you ever experimented without pre-shaping at all? Go right from the bulk ferment into the oven?
Yes. Yeah. This was really a fascinating thing that I came across. When I was doing my early experiments, I was trying to focus on what impact the different bulk fermentation times had on the crumb. So I would, bulk ferment for 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours. And then what I was finding was that the pre-shaping and final shaping was introducing irregularity into the crumb, where I couldn't really tell if it was overproofing or underproofing related, because you create air bubbles and things like that with the shaping. So just as a scientific experiment, I said, I'm just going to take the dough out of bulk fermentation, flop it into a shaping basket, and do no shaping at all. No pre-shaping and no final shaping. Put it in the refrigerator overnight. Comes out the next morning. I score it. I bake it. You couldn't tell the difference.
Exactly.
If I showed you that loaf versus a pre-shaped and final shaped loaf, they looked exactly the same. Because if you get the structure, the bulk fermentation makes the bread. I mean, the fermentation process and that creation of the gluten matrix that you do during bulk fermentation, that's what makes the loaf. Pre-shaping, totally overrated, not even really necessary.
I don't pre-shape.
Yeah,
I don't pre-shape because I don't have time. I don't have 75 baskets.
Yeah.
Especially seriously, like I started trying to do this. I thought it was going to improve my bread making, so I would cut cardboard shelves to put on top of the baskets.
Yeah.
And stack them and put as many loaves as I could in this refrigerator, and it made no difference. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's in the refrigerator for 48 hours.
Yeah.
There's something that just happens to that dough. It's going to basically mold to the basket.
Exactly.
Or even if, I'm sorry, I'm not using a basket in this case. So it's the same thing. It's just like at that point, shaping it, putting it in. And I could tell at this point, it's going to come out pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting because, you have a process that works for you. Correct. With no pre-shaping, but the whole chain of events that happens prior to that allows that to work. So, your hydration level of your dough, the type of the flour that you use, the amount of handling that you do during bulk fermentation, and the amount of bulk fermentation that you do literally down to the minute allows you to not pre-shape and just do that final shaping at the end. If that process works for you, this is what drives people crazy. Is they say, oh, I heard this guy on a podcast and he said, I don't need to do pre-shaping. And then they skip that step. Right. And then their loaf doesn't work, but it's because they didn't have all the steps prior to that. And this, that's the confounding thing that drives people nuts with sourdough baking, is that all the steps are interrelated, and everybody asks a question about one thing. They're like, how do I need to pre-shape my loaf? What's the best way to score my loaf to get an ear? The scoring is the last thing that produces the ear. It's like, and then people say, oh, you hold the blade at a 45-degree angle. That only works if the loaf is set up to bloom anyways, and then scoring is just telling it where to open up. But if you didn't ferment the dough properly, build the gluten structure, and shape it properly, it's not going to open up on the bloom if you score it or if you don't score it. So the scoring, doesn't create the ear. It allows it to happen, tells it where to go, but it's all the steps prior to that.
You're going to get some type of ear if you do everything right, whether you do a 45-degree angle or a straight angle.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's just different. It's just a different look if you do everything right.
Yeah, totally.
By the time this comes out, it'll have aired already an episode on water and the outcome of bread. And specifically, that episode is about New York water.
Yeah.
But I heard you talk about chlorine.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really interesting because not a lot of people in the episode I did talked about that.
Yeah.
and it makes a lot of common sense to me.
Yeah.
But because also I want to go to 3 different cities and try to bake the breads I bake and see if they come out the same. I really
Yeah.
want to try an experiment like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you talk about putting a chlorine filter. They add chlorine where you live.
That's right.
Talk about that and what chlorine could do to bread.
Yeah, I always use filtered water for feeding my starter and for my dough. Um, and I mean, the basic idea is that your sourdough starter is a microbial culture, and chlorine is basically, bleach that kills microbial cultures. So by adding chlorine to your starter and to your dough, it's going to kill off some amount of the yeast and lactic acid bacteria. It's just the nature of what it does. Now, I actually saw a study on this where I saw somebody who tested different levels of chlorination, and they got up to almost like swimming pool water level of chlorination before it had a material difference on the loaf. So I haven't done that research on my own, but just based on that one study that I saw, I can't say for certain that chlorine is the factor that would cause a loaf to fail or not. It just logically, it's not great to add, chlorine to a microbial culture. But I don't have an answer for that one. I'd have to do a little bit more research on that. I did do one study in one of the early videos I made called 50 Ways to Kill Your Starter. And this is one of my humorous videos where, all these people post on Facebook, oh, I fed my starter at the wrong time. Did I kill it? I fed my starter the wrong flour. Did I kill it? I gave it tap water instead of bottled water. Did I kill it? I mean, these questions, you get these questions every day. So I said, okay, I'm just gonna solve all these questions once and for all. So I did a number of experiments, and in that one, this was really just to see if I could kill the starter. I mixed it up to about a 5% bleach solution and fed my starter with that. And it definitely slowed it down, but it didn't kill it. It came back after a couple of days.
Oh my God.
But I preheated my starter in the oven. People do that by accident. Sometimes they'll leave their starter in the oven with the light on to keep it in a warm place. Then the kid comes home from school and wants to make some hot pockets or something and preheats the oven, and their starter gets baked. That couldn't kill it. Then I took one and used a blowtorch on it till it was totally black. That didn't kill it. I mixed it with chlorine. I fed it gluten-free flours. I fed it xanthan gum, just any stuff I could pull out of my pantry that wasn't flour. And I mixed up my starter feeding with that. I think I tried 24 different things before I quit, and nothing killed it.
Wow.
The only one that it didn't actually kill it, but you have to get rid of it is if it gets moldy.
Right.
And I even put my starter in a moldy place to try to get it to attract mold. And it still wouldn't attract mold, because if you have a healthy starter, the pH balance of your starter will repel mold. And I actually had to take a hunk of mold and stick it in the starter to get it to propagate. And it barely did. But then once you get the mold in there, that one is obviously, you can't go back from that. Some people say you can scrape it off the top. I wouldn't do that, because the tendrils from the mold go all the way down into the starter. You really got to pitch it.
It's a red mold, right? That happens.
That's the worst one.
I've had that early on with before I refrigerated.
Yep.
I had that happen.
Yeah. People get that pink and red one. That's really dangerous to eat also, but people will also get black mold on it. The more traditional type, usually if they're not scraping down the sides of their starter vessel, it'll start to form right on that barrier where it's kind of partially dried starter, because the acidity of the wet starter won't allow the mold to grow in it, but that kind of almost dried starter is where it'll start.
Yeah. One or two last questions.
Sure.
If it an overproofed bulk ferment, is it over, or is there anything you could do? Does that mean that the lactic acid built up so much that
Yes.
it's over dominating the yeast?
That's correct.
And if you put that in the refrigerator at that point for 2 more days,
Yeah.
Does it give the yeast a chance, and does it
No.
slow down the? No, it's done.
It's too late. There's no way to undo it. It's kind of like scrambled eggs. It's like the bulk fermentation is like scrambled eggs, where it's like you watch it for 5 minutes, it's not doing anything. You have that 30-second window to kind of get it exactly how you want it. That's the perfect bulk fermentation analogy. And then once the eggs get hard, you can't unharden them again. I mean, there's no way. I mean, what I tell people is if you think it's overproofed coming out of bulk fermentation, you can feel it kind of breaking down in your hands. I mean, the dough will start to fall apart, but it's not quite as liquefied as a starter, for example. I'll tell people to try to shape it. You can try to fold it, try to shape it. And if it'll hold any shape at all, just bake it. I say, if it'll hold any shape, bake it. If it's not completely liquefied like your starter, pour it into a baking pan and bake it. And if it's almost liquefied, spread it on a baking sheet, add some olive oil and some herbs, and make a kind of bastardized focaccia.
Right.
Those are really your options. There's no way to add more flour to it. There's no way to recover it. Once the gluten is gone, it's gone. The lactic acid bacteria eats the gluten, and then you can't get it back.
Got it. Now, what did you do before all this?
Totally unrelated. I was in business consulting for 30 years. So I traveled around the world helping companies fix problems with their accounting systems and processes. So, companies would merge with another company, and somebody had to figure out how to get all the financial statements and all the systems to work together. So I did that for 30 years. I retired in the summer of 2019. And I never looked back. I got rid of all my work clothes. I never planned to be in the business world again. And I've completely left that behind and just wanted to try something different. And what I found through sourdough is the thing that I really missed is science and research and teaching. I mean, so it took me 30 years to find out I was in the wrong profession.
Yeah. So my son graduated college this weekend. Looking back, I see you have no regrets now. But do you have any advice for someone like him or a young person who might have a mild interest in this, and in the other ear is having someone say, you got to really figure out how to make a living. Accounting's great. Not that there's anything wrong with accounting.
Yeah. No, it's a toss up, and I the kind of easy answer is to say, follow your passion and do what you want to do. But that's a tough road. And there's more to, you got to really think about what do you want to get out of your whole life. So for me, I chose that route, which I loved. I mean, I enjoyed that work while I was doing it, but I was able to retire when I was 54. And now I got a lot of years ahead of me to do other things that I like. So, you got to kind of look at the whole equation. I can't really give, kind of short answer. I'd say always do what you're passionate about. I mean, I like I said, I loved what I was doing when I was doing it, but it was just tough work. But yeah, do something that you're passionate about for sure.
All right. Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on and talking to me. I love what you do.
Thank you.
I have learned a lot from you. Your website is The Sourdough Journey.
Yep.
Everyone check it out. Follow Tom on YouTube. You're on all the socials, right?
YouTube and Facebook are really the two that I focus on most.
Okay, well, great.
Not on Instagram.
Not on Instagram?
No, I'm old school. Facebook only for me.
All right.
I can only handle one at a time. I spend so much time out there, so I can't get spread too thin because I really try to give individual feedback to people who need help.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed meeting you and talking to you, man.
Thanks, Jim. It was great.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye. This episode of Bread for the People was edited by Rick Beck and produced by Milestone TV and Film. If you have an idea for an episode or just want to reach out and get in touch with me, feel free to drop me an email at breadforthepeoplepod@gmail.com. Blessed be the bread, everyone.